we've covered initially like a background on what money was. We've looked at how the financial system works to a certain extent and how Bitcoin works in contrast, done a deeper dive on Bitcoin mining and also some of the environmental concerns around it. One part about Bitcoin that people are not terribly familiar with, but is actually fascinating, is its applications for humanitarian causes. So that's what I'm going to touch on today, and I'll recap on some of the items that we've looked at on previous sessions. So I'm going to talk a lot and draw a lot on the work of somebody called Anita Posch and Alex Gladstein. But I wanted to read this quote from Anita Posch before I sort of go into who both of those individuals are. So she says, Bitcoin isn't useless, it's priceless. Anyone who is lobbying for a Bitcoin ban or attempts to control it is an enemy of freedom and humankind. It's a voluntary network, and if you don't like it, don't use it. So today we're going to cover the global impact of unsound money. We're going to look at the IMF and the World Bank, look at the Financial Action Task Force, the FATF, monetary colonialism, escaping authoritarian regimes, and then also touching on Bitcoin and women's rights. So, and lastly, ending with a Q&A. So the effect of unsound money has actually been well known for a long time. Richard Cantillon wrote about the Cantillon effect. He was alive from 1680 to 1734. So he wrote this essay on the nature of trade in general. And he talked about how a rise in money supply would result in a rise in prices. And he commented that those closest to the new supply would benefit at the expense of those who received the supply later. So if you think about the fact that those who are close to the issuance of the money, who are working either at a central bank or a commercial bank, they would receive the benefit or the monetary benefit, the profit, if you like, from issuing that money before the currency was devalued. Once that filters down to the general population, the prices go up and everybody's money is devalued. But by that point, those closest to the printing press effectively have received the benefit. So it's usually the poorest in society that actually get hit by the impact in inflation. And also because if you're already kind of subsisting at the margins, an increase in food prices can make a huge difference to you. In the first session, we touched on how the UK moved off of the gold standard. And I just wanted to recap that one of the ways that the UK was able to protect its economy in the lead up to the First World War was by exporting its inflation to the colonies. So it did this by requiring its colonies to hold their reserves in pounds. And this system functioned fairly well for the British until at least the people that were living in the UK and were able to benefit from that inflation export until World War I, when people started demanding the money back from the central banks, from the Bank of England, rather, the British Central Bank. And the bank didn't have enough gold to give them for their paper IOUs. So they suspended the redeemability of paper for gold, and this was intended again to be temporary, but like many of these measures, it ended up being a permanent situation. So what happened to the US in this period? Well, the US was a beneficiary of this post World War I and World War II, because it wasn't subject to the devastation from the war. They weren't engaged for the most part, at least in the beginning, in active conflict with either of those two wars. And the US became a safe haven for gold. So countries that wanted to protect their gold would store it in the US and export it. And this kind of carried on from World War I through to World War II. The US would issue them with dollars. The UK gradually became less important as a reserve currency. In fact, the British pound was no longer a reserve currency, a global reserve currency. And the US moved to take this role. This effect was increased in the 1970s. So the US made a pact with Saudi Arabia, where essentially the Saudis would price their oil exports in dollars. And this created the petrodollar system and allowed the US to maintain its dominance as a reserve currency. You will have seen probably some recent news stories that haven't made the headlines as much as they should have done, but the Saudis have been talking about pricing some of their oil exports now in yuan. And that threatens the petrodollar system quite significantly. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out on a geopolitical level. But what it would indicate would be that the Saudis are coming to see the US as less and less relevant as a reserve currency, and that the globe is kind of shifting away from this. So the geopolitical impact of this will be interesting to see play out. So the Second World War was obviously hugely destructive, and there was a belief among some of the richer nations, mostly in the western part of the world, but also Japan, that this was caused by a lack of coordination in the global financial system. So they gathered in July 1944 in Bretton Woods, and it was a United Nations monetary and financial conference, essentially. And this meeting resulted in the creation of several global institutions that, for the most part, persist today. So they created the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD. This has later become part of the World Bank Group. So essentially, the World Bank has the functions that the IBRD had. And the purpose of this institution was reconstruction. So they work on specific large reconstruction projects, rather than just issuing loans. The membership to the IMF is mandatory in order to be able to access the World Bank's funds. So you can't be a member of one and not of the other. And the International Monetary Fund works to stabilize exchange rates, and it will make loans out to countries that are in trouble, struggling, and need assistance, essentially. One of the items that was tabled at Bretton Woods, which did not get pushed through, was the dissolution of the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. And for those who are not familiar with the BIS, and many people don't even know that this organization exists, certainly not if people are outside of financial markets, but they are essentially a bank of central banks. So their function is to be a bank for all central banks. And they were based out of Switzerland and were ostensibly supposed to be a neutral organization, but they very much struggled to maintain their neutrality during the war, and there were several Nazi members that sat on the board. So the Norwegian delegation to Bretton Woods were very keen for this institution to be dissolved, but the impetus for this kind of died out after the death of Roosevelt. So the European countries were much more supportive of this because they had seen the destruction that had happened during the Second World War. And they didn't feel that the Bank of International Settlements was a neutral organization. But essentially, this kind of didn't move ahead after Roosevelt's death. So the Bank of International Settlements still exists. And arguably, it's a little bit of a strange situation because a lot of what they do is very similar to what the IMF does. So there is a case to be said that you don't necessarily need both organizations. The last item that I just wanted to touch on that came out of Bretton Woods was the pegging of exchange rates to the US dollar. So the US dollar essentially became the reserve currency on a theoretically gold standard. So the US dollar was convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. So countries were able to store their gold in the US, their gold reserves. They received dollars for that, and they could convert the dollars at $35 per ounce of gold. This situation, however, did not persist because the United States was very fond of their printing press. And so after Kennedy was assassinated, and, you know, to be fair, actually, in the lead up to this as well, they were issuing more money than they had gold reserves for. So after Kennedy was assassinated, this persisted under the subsequent president. So his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was sworn in. He became president of the United States and carried on some of those policies that Kennedy had put in place, but also kind of increased them under his own watch. And they increased military spending, so that went towards the Vietnam War. And they did a big social spending program, which Lyndon B. Johnson called the Great Society. So that was when the US started to adopt policies like food stamps, Medicare, and grants were given from the government to schools and colleges. So rather than schools and colleges essentially being funded primarily through the students paying to attend them, the grants were given to schools and colleges from the government. The military spending on Vietnam War, you could argue that that was, it subsidized essentially the military-industrial complex. So the US's increasing involvement may have been for economic reasons and not just because of its belief in the fact that that was a war that should have been continued. In the first session, we looked at what happened in 1971. And again, if you want to go and look at the website, what WTF happened in 1971. So what the fuck happened in 1971? That talks at length about what happened in the US financial system. But basically, countries started to wise up to the fact that the US was printing more dollars than it had gold reserves for. So they started requesting their gold reserves back. And the US's debt at this point was very high. So I've just noted there that it was 11 billion in gold, backed by 24 billion in dollars. So countries started going to the US and saying, hey, actually, we want our gold back. That increasingly depleted the US's gold reserves. And it became very difficult for them to continue this sort of facade of being on a gold standard. So they essentially defaulted. Nixon declared that the US will temporarily stop exchange for US dollars for gold. And again, like many of these temporary measures, it became permanent. And the US at this point essentially moved to what we now call a fiat standard. Because the US dollar was a reserve currency for the rest of the world, this action essentially brought the entire rest of the world, for the most part, into a fiat standard as well. So what's a fiat standard? We touched on this on the first session, but I wanted to revisit that. So it's the Latin word fiat means literally let it be done. So in English, it's used to denote something that is done by decree. So if something is done by fiat, it's done by decree. And what that means is the ultimate enforcement of that decree is through force or through violence, because that's the ultimate weapon that the state has to force its citizens into doing something that is, or forcing them to do something that's done by that's mandated by decree. So as I said, because most central banks globally hold US dollar reserves, everybody's money gets devalued when the Fed creates money out of thin air. So every time money is created, the dollar standard that the world is operating on drags all of the countries that are using the US dollar as a reserve currency into that devaluation, and they have no democratic say on this. So there are literally 12 people in the US that sit around a table and effectively decide these policies, and they impact the economics of the vast majority of countries around the world. That brings me to kind of delve into the humanitarian impact of this more deeply. So I'm drawing largely on the work here of Anita Posch and Alex Gladstein. So Anita Posch is the founder of an organization called Bitcoin for Fairness, and she works very closely with countries in the African continent, helping them adopt Bitcoin. And I'll explain why that's such a focus for her as well in a following slide when we look at the monetary system of some African countries and the impact of some of these developmental loans. But she hosts a podcast, she teaches about how to utilize Bitcoin, and she runs this educational non-for-profit organization. She's a member of Bitcoin Austrian non-profit educational organization for Bitcoin. This quote from her I wanted to read. She says, "Bitcoin might be our only tool to secure the human right to privacy and freedom of transaction. It's a medium of liberation for billions of people and a defense mechanism for privacy in our ever more digital lives." Alex Gladstein, so he is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Human Rights Foundation, and he also teaches at the Singularity University and is an advisor at Blockchain Capital. He has written extensively on this topic, so I've referenced a lot of his work in the further reading section. And if you can make the time to read some of his articles and his research pieces, they are really, really worth the time because he's delved into this very deeply. And his latest piece is about the actions of the IMF and the World Bank on developing countries. And he has also done several podcast sessions talking about this. So I've referenced one of them in the further reading section, which is the interview that he did with What Bitcoin Did on this topic. But I would highly recommend, looking into those in more depth. So let's look at the IMF and the World Bank. So their establishment, their purpose in the past and the present. So the IMF is traditionally headed by a European and the World Bank is traditionally headed by an American, but both are based in Washington, DC. And I've put a screenshot here of Google Maps so you get a sense of how closely they're connected. So they are literally next door to each other in Washington, D.C., but they are actually connected by tunnels. So the two organizations work very much in lockstep, and they typically tend to work together on various projects with the same countries. Again, as I said, the IMF was created in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. So their purpose, or stated purpose, international monetary cooperation and the stabilization of exchange rates. So if a country's imports exceed their exports, what the IMF can do is provide a loan. So essentially, if they're buying more stuff in than they are producing and selling, then the IMF can provide them with a loan. And how does the IMF do this? So the IMF is funded by its members. So they will deposit funds with the IMF. And if they run into trouble, they can draw on those funds at a later date. It does, however, have the right to engage in special drawing rights, SDRs, and these are essentially money printing. So it's done this 3 times in its history, and most recently that was during the 2008 financial crisis. But in theory and in practice, they can print money. The way that they make decisions is through voting primarily, and at least on large decisions. And the votes are not equally distributed among the member countries. They are distributed based on the economic size of a country. So you can extrapolate from that the US would have a much greater sway in the IMF than any other country. And they also vote on giving loans. So in conjunction, and those are done by a majority vote. So in conjunction with its allies, the US can generally pass any vote for a loan if it wants to. So that's kind of the dynamic of how the organization is run. And the fact that it sits in Washington, D.C. is sort of quite indicative of the fact that it's clearly a very US dominated institution. So post-war, actually, sorry, and I just wanted to reiterate that as well. I think I've put that here on this slide, but in order to access the World Bank's development funds, so the infrastructure funds, you need to be a member of the IMF. So that's the precondition for accessing those funds as well. So post-World War II, the IMF and the World Bank started off helping rebuild Europe and Japan. So they had a huge amount of focus on rebuilding those economies and getting them back on their feet after World War II. And arguably, the intent was good, at least at the outset, and they were successful in doing that because Europe and Japan ended up, getting back up on their feet relatively quickly. From the mid-1950s onwards, as Europe and Japan were sort of no longer necessitating that support, they started moving their focus towards developing countries. Just one footnote on this as well is that Alex Gladstein has a theory about the Great Depression that I think is just worth mentioning here. So he has a theory that the reason, or one of the principal reasons why the US sunk into the Great Depression in 1929 was because the process of decolonization had started across the globe. And that ability to export inflation and to utilize the resources of other countries started to disappear. And that was what threw the US into a depression. So it's an interesting theory. I'm not sure 100% how much one can definitively say that that's correct, but that's kind of what he focuses on. So that trend continued over the next few decades after the 1930s. And these developing countries started to gain independence. So the IMF and the World Bank shift their focus to the developing countries. And what does that mean? So I just want to reiterate here that loans are not charity. So people think of the IMF and the work that they do as being charitable, but what they're essentially doing is making a loan to a country, and that loan has to be repaid back in full with interest, and the interest rate is usually very high. And it doesn't come without preconditions. So I'm going to touch on the preconditions in a subsequent slide. But what they want to do is discourage local consumption and get those countries to take resources that they have and export them for profit. And the idea behind that is that the countries can then afford to pay back the loans and the interest that they have on those loans. But really what happens in practice is that Western countries benefit from this restructuring of a country's economy who has received the loan. because they're getting raw materials and goods and things that they want to eat as a consequence of this. And it's important to remember that that loan sits on the balance sheets of the IMF and the World Bank as an asset. So they have an incentive for those countries to pay back those loans. And they don't want the countries to default on those loans. And that's a very important thing to remember in terms of how they are administered, because they have a huge incentive at the IMF and the World Bank to ensure that any money that goes into these countries is paid back and is paid back with interest. And it's essentially a revenue stream for these organizations. So what are the preconditions that come with these loans? So typically the IMF demands would include, and I took this from the World Bank book by Cheryl Payer, which is referenced by Alex Gladstein, but typically they would include currency devaluation. So as Bitcoiners, we know how bad that is. Like devaluing a currency results in essentially your wealth being devalued. So now what you have is worth less money. The abolition or reduction of foreign exchange and import controls. So what that means is that you essentially can't put manufactured controls in place on your currency and on imports. This seems in practice like, if you're a capitalist, that might seem like a good thing, but bear in mind that many Western developed nations have these types of controls. So the fact that through the IMF and the World Bank, they are then demanding that less developed nations do not have them gives you some sense of the imbalance there. Shrinking of domestic bank credit, higher interest rates. So that obviously results in people in these countries who have received the loans having higher interest repayments on any loans that they have, an increase in taxes. So now they're squeezed again. An end to consumer subsidies on food and energy. And again, this is something that on paper might look great, but if you consider that the UK has free healthcare for its citizens, but Sri Lanka, which was subsidizing rice for its citizens, was being told that it wasn't allowed to do that. So now people can't eat, but it's okay for the UK to have free healthcare. So that's just something to consider in terms of these conditions. Restrictions on government spending, especially in healthcare and education. I don't need to really explain why that might not be a good thing. Wage ceilings. So again, price of everything is going up because there's currency devaluation, but you're not allowed to put minimum wage requirements in place. Favorable conditions for multinationals, selling off of state enterprises, and claims on natural resources at fire sale prices. So that means that external institutions and organizations that are not of that country can come in and buy up assets for cheap. World Bank is very similar. So again, they fund specific infrastructure projects rather than general loans, but essentially it's a very similar playbook. But it's around ending sort of legal privileges or tax liabilities, improving legal privileges or tax liabilities for foreign investors. So companies coming in that are building infrastructure get special conditions, opening up previously remote regions through transportation and telecommunications investments. And this is not, high-speed broadband for the local population. This is essentially the World Bank saying, well, we want to increase or improve the infrastructure for companies that want to come in there and extract resources. So again, you can see it's a very similar playbook to the IMF. Alex Gladstein makes a comment that the IMF and World Bank never met a dictator they did not like. And I think it's important to touch a little bit on why the reasons for this might be. So if you think about the fact that you're making a loan to a nation and you want certain policies, your structural adjustments to be implemented, a very efficient way of doing that is through a dictator. It's much harder to do that in a country that is poor, maybe unstable, with a democratic process in place that can be messy. So it's somewhat understandable that they would find it easier to work with a dictator, but it's worth bearing in mind that the citizens of these countries therefore have not voted for these loans that they are receiving, and they've not voted for the structural adjustment that happens in their countries. But they are liable essentially through their productivity for the repayment of these loans to Western nations and to the IMF and the World Bank, or to Western nations via the IMF and the World Bank. There's a concept called odious loans that Alex Gladstein talks about in the podcast he does that I referenced in the further reading materials. And he talks about how this term first came into play, I think, in Cuba, where when the Americans came in and essentially, took over Cuba from the Spaniards, they said, well, you know what, you're not really reliable for these loans or these debts, rather, that you have to repay under a dictatorial government. So therefore, they're odious loans, they're going to get written off. And arguably, you could say that if a dictator has negotiated a loan for a developing country, the citizens of that country actually should not be liable for those loans. And the problem is that as those loans get funneled through the dictators, they can scrape as much of that loan off as they want for their own wealth, and purchase assets outside of their home country, and then just administer what's left, I guess, to the nation. Follow the requirements of the structural adjustment requirements, but there's no democratic process behind this typically. So the World Bank in its statutes actually says the World Bank and its officers shall not interfere in the political affairs of any member, nor shall they be influenced in their decisions by the political character of the member of all members concerned, and only economic considerations should be relevant. I've referenced an article in the further reading material, and you can see in practice this hasn't really lived up to. So one example is Allende, a Chilean democratically elected leader. He was considered, or his country, Chile, was considered ineligible for loans during the period that he was in power. But when Pinochet came in via a coup, so not democratically elected in 1973, now all of a sudden Chile became eligible. Similar examples are Mobutu in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, Somoza in Nicaragua, Ceausescu in Romania, and so on. And this pattern plays out over and over again when the loans are approved by the IMF. So at this point, you might be wondering, are the IMF and the World Bank loan sharks? Well, I think let's look at the data and just see how this plays out for the countries where they're operating. So this is a graph that shows the change in external debt in all developing countries from 1980 to 2012 in billions. And you can see it goes from roughly zero in 1978 all the way through up here in 2012. So this is in billions. At some point, this is a quote again from Alex Gladstein, at some point the borrower has to pay more to his creditor than he has received from the creditor over the life of the loan. This excess is much higher than the amount that was originally borrowed. So yes, any loan, you pay back more than you took out in the loan, essentially. But for these loans, the excess is much higher than the amount that was originally borrowed. And as you can see, it becomes impossible for these countries to get out of debt. So that they're essentially on a permanent state of debt cycle. He goes on to say, in global economics, this point happened in 1982, even when the flow of resources permanently reserved. Ever since, there has been an annual net flow of funds from poor countries to rich countries. And this is essentially a type of financial colonialism, really. So where you don't have governmental colonialism, these countries are indebted to the West and they are exporting their resources to the West in order to fund debts that they have incurred, largely through dictators that they didn't vote for. So you can draw your own conclusions about how just that might be. I wanted to look at a case study for Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is an example that Alex Gladstein goes into in detail in his article. Bangladesh had an independence leader in the 1980s who was assassinated, and a new autocratic leader came and replaced him. And they started working immediately with Western governments, the World Bank and the IMF, to take out loans. And the structural adjustment requirements, again, where Bangladesh increased its exports in order to pay off the loan and pay the interest. And it's worth just mentioning here something about the geography of Bangladesh. So Bangladesh sits in a kind of tunnel where they're very prone to hurricanes and a lot of flooding. And it was also home to very rich mangrove forests, but some work was done in Bangladesh to protect the coastline as well from this flooding. So trenches were dug out in order to absorb some of this seawater so that the mainland wouldn't get flooded. So they had a kind of twofold barrier, which was the mango trees and the trenches. And what happened was they also had a very rich kind of shrimp population in the bay on which Bangladesh sits. And shrimp was a very, very valuable export. It's often called white gold. And so part of the structural adjustment demands were that Bangladesh start exporting more shrimp. So what they did was they took shrimp from the sea, they put it into these trenches and they filled them with salt water, and they started farming the shrimp in those trenches. And so that led to the decimation of a lot of their farmland, because the farmland became, infested by the salty water, and locals were no longer able to grow crops. So they went from sort of subsistence farming to suddenly no farming, because they couldn't grow crops because their farmland was destroyed, and they were now farming shrimp for export, not for themselves, for export. And they're now having to go and buy food from the market instead of growing it themselves. So yes, they are exporting more goods, and on paper, economically, that looks like a great success. But in reality, the local population no longer has the ability to feed themselves, and they are essentially slaves to a shrimp farming industry that is overseen by a dictatorial leader and shrimp lords who manage the shrimp farming process, both of whom are benefiting financially from this. And the local population is not seeing the benefit of those loans. And I believe in Bangladesh, shrimp is still the second largest export that they have. So what was the impact of all of this? So after 10 structural adjustments, Bangladesh's debt pile has grown exponentially from 145 million in 1972 to an all-time high of 95.9 billion in 2022. The country is facing yet another balance of payments crisis, and just this month agreed to take its 11th loan from the IMF, this time a 4.5 billion bailout in exchange for more adjustment. I also wanted to briefly touch on the Financial Action Task Force. So this was created in 1989 by the G7 to combat financial crime. And unfortunately, what's happened is they've put a bunch of legislation in place, which means that many countries are deemed to not be safe for financial investments or loans or any kind of banking activity. And the impact of this has been about 2 billion unbanked people. So they're essentially in countries that are not approved by the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force, it's estimated that they seize only about 1% of illegal profits. So you have approximately 2 billion people who are unbanked, and a very, very low success rate in terms of combating financial crime at the expense of ordinary people who now can't access banking systems because their countries are not deemed to be safe enough or compliant enough. So that gives you some context to the impact in developing countries of some of these institutions that richer countries have put in place. Saifeddin Ammous he is a Palestinian Jordanian. He is the author of the Bitcoin Standard and the Fiat Standard. I would highly recommend reading both of these books. They're incredible, and they're really worth touching on. But I wanted to read his quote. So he says, on top of destroying the market economies of poor countries and turning them into centrally planned failures, the large amounts of debt enable them to persist longer in failed policies, which conveniently gives the donor governments a great excuse to politically control these governments. The net result is that the third world is not just centrally planned, but also accountable to foreigners instead of locals. Without the misery industry to bail out every kleptocrat in the third world, the alternative would not be constant inflation and recession. On the contrary, it would only take one of these crises to completely destroy the government that engaged in it, i.e. the dictatorial government, thus allowing a country a new start. Had kleptocrats not constantly had recourse to the international financial institutions' endless credit line, they'd quickly bankrupt themselves until they are replaced by governments that behave responsibly and only spend less than they tax, i.e. don't engage in money printing. So to touch back on the monetary colonialism, I wanted to just look at this case of Africa. So some of you might be familiar with Giorgia Meloni, who is Italy's prime minister. There was recently a video that kind of went viral of her on social media where she was calling out President Macron and France as a country for engaging in monetary colonialism. And many people didn't know about what she was referencing, but there are 14 nations in Africa that use a thing called the CFA franc. And that is essentially a currency that is pegged to the French franc. And it's controlled by France, administered, I believe, by Cameroon in that nation. And what that means is that those nations, although they're not still technically politically colonized by France, France is still able to control their monetary system. And the reasoning given for this is that they promote monetary stability. But I wanted to just give this example that in 1994, France actually devalued the CFA by 50%, devastating the savings and purchasing power of tens of millions of people living in the countries, ranging from Senegal to Ivory Coast to Gabon, to make raw goods exports more competitive. And consider that if you had savings in your bank and they were suddenly devalued by 50% based on the actions of a country other than your own, what that might do to your financial security and stability, and how you might feel about that. So I guess we have to ask the question, does Bitcoin actually fix this? So Bitcoin is often called a peaceful revolution. And why is that? So Bitcoin promotes property rights that can't be confiscated. So if you hold your seed phrase and you hold your Bitcoin, you can self-custody it and it can't be taken away from you. And I'll explain briefly why, because you can memorize the 12 words in your head that will reconstitute your Bitcoin wallet. You don't even need to carry a piece of paper if you can memorize those 12 words. And that means that you can take your wealth in Bitcoin across borders without having to actually carry anything physical. So that's a huge revolution, really. This sort of equates to freedom. So it gives you the freedom to control your own money. There is no central government that can devalue that money. There is no monetary institution. There is no international organization that can devalue what you own. Bitcoin supply is fixed. Its issuance schedule is fixed. It sort of varies very slightly, but we know that the last Bitcoin will be mined in 2140. So it's great for security, it's great for freedom, and it allows you to protect your wealth from being debased essentially through the monetary policy of global organizations and countries around the world. Anita Posch has written extensively about this piece. So she has a great article in Bitcoin Magazine, but she looks at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was signed in 1948, and again was sort of a result of the aftermath of the Second World War. And I wanted to touch on some of the articles that she references because they tie in very closely actually with what Bitcoin achieves for all humanity, but particularly in countries where, you know, they're living under autocratic regimes and don't have the freedoms that we have in Western countries. So Article 12, no one shall be subjected to arbitrary interference with his privacy, family, home or correspondence, nor to attacks upon his honor and reputation. Everyone has the right to protection of the law against such interference or attacks. So again, if you consider this, that, you know, if you hold on to your Bitcoin, in theory, that privacy, that financial privacy that you have can't be interfered with. And I think that's really important, particularly in the digital age where privacy is becoming a bigger and bigger concern. This is really meaningful for people in countries where there is oppression, but also just for individuals in situations where there is oppression, where they might have family members that are you know, trying to steal their wealth from them. Article 13 says everyone has a right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Doing that can be very difficult if you're escaping a war and you want to be able to take everything with you. So, you know, you would have concerns about abandoning your house, abandoning gold that you have stored in a vault in a bank, any kind of property that you have that might be transportable under normal circumstances. In a war situation, this isn't always the case. So again, Bitcoin allows you to do that because you can store the 12 words in your head. Article 17 says everyone has a right to own property, alone as well as in association. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his property. So we have seen financial censorship happening increasingly. So we saw this in Canada during the Canadian trucker protest, where the banks, the government essentially froze people's bank accounts who were involved or supporting the protest. We've seen this happen now in Iran, where women who refuse to wear the hijab have basically been told you're going to get 2 text message warnings, and after the second warning, we'll freeze your bank account. That can't be done with Bitcoin as long as you self-custody it and you don't hold it on exchange and just have an IOU. So again, these are extremely important use cases for Bitcoin, and financial censorship is becoming an increasing problem, not just in countries that we consider developing. We're kind of like, oh yeah, that happens over in Iran, so what? It's happening increasingly in Western countries. Another example was in the UK recently. PayPal had frozen the account of a free speech organization, so that created a huge backlash. But the fact that they were able and willing to do that should give everybody pause for thought about, what the fiat monetary system actually is, because you don't own your wealth within it. You basically have an IOU, and that item on the digital ledger in your bank account can be devalued and debased, and is devalued and debased by your government on a consistent basis. I think with official inflation running at somewhere around 10% across Western countries. Article 19 again touches on that, so everyone has the freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes the freedom to hold opinions without interference, etc., etc. And again, Bitcoin prevents financial censorship, and it means that your livelihood cannot be jeopardized, or your wealth cannot be jeopardized because you have an opinion that the government doesn't agree with at that time. Escaping authoritarian regimes. Again, I think in Western countries, people don't appreciate how difficult this can be. 80% of the planet lives under autocracy and is forced into untrustworthy currencies. So that means essentially currencies that can be debased, that are very volatile. We've seen in some countries like Zimbabwe where this is happening at a crazy rate. But don't forget that every country that we live in has high rates of inflation now. So again, they're not really trustworthy currencies because you can't inspect them. You can't in any way have control over how much of that money is printed. 4.3 billion people live under authoritarianism, and 1.2 billion people live under double or triple digit inflation. I believe this article that I've quoted from is from May 2022. So you could probably apply this to the majority of Western countries at this point. Bitcoin is not only digital money, it is digital property. And that's very important to remember. Therefore, self-custodying, so not on exchange, your Bitcoin, makes you an owner of property. Since Bitcoin is permissionless, the right to own property is granted to anyone. And this is really key to the value proposition of Bitcoin. It doesn't care about your politics. It doesn't care about your gender. It doesn't care about your sexual orientation. It doesn't care about any of these things. And there will always be those that seek to control and prevent others from, living their true selves, or oppress people based on how they look, or, what their beliefs are, and so on. And so Bitcoin protects your wealth from these authoritarian tendencies of both governments and people. And again, you do this through simply memorizing 12 words. So if you have your private key, you've got your seed phrase converted into 12 words, you can memorize those 12 words, and you can literally cross a border with nothing on you and have your Bitcoin secured until such a time as you can access the internet, you can reconstitute your wallet and access those funds. Bitcoin and women's rights. I mean, this one is huge. So in 2017, the World Bank estimated that 1.7 billion people were unbanked, and 57% of those were women. Women don't have the rights to property in many countries. Like I've put the Afghan flag there, and that's just a very key example. We've seen, the tumult of what women have gone through with the changing regimes in Afghanistan, with their rights continually being eroded. And again, Bitcoin gives them a way to secure their property, to store property, and to be able to transport that out of a country if they are able to at some point. So it's unbelievably revolutionary for women all over the world, and much more so than Western women can generally appreciate. So lastly, I wanted to make a few book recommendations. There is a book that was written quite some time ago, but it was by Dambisa Moyo called Dead Aid. So she is a research analyst who originally started at Goldman Sachs. She moved on to write about various different economic topics. She's from Africa. She's very against foreign aid. And this was really one of my first introductions years ago into the sort of toxicity of foreign aid, but it's well worth a read. The other one I touched on, I did a quote from Saifedean Ammous, but again, The Fiat Standard, a fantastic book. There is a whole section on this in the book that talks about the IMF and the World Bank. And lastly, I came across this book, Lords of Poverty, while I was doing some of the research. And I haven't actually read this book, but it was referenced in several of the articles. It looked super interesting. It's unfortunately not available on ebooks, it seems, so you can only buy it hard copy. It's a little bit hard to get hold of, but I would recommend it just based on some of the quotes that I saw from the book, and I will definitely be putting it on my reading list as well. I did actually, I forgot to add in here Alex Gladstein's book, Check Your Financial Privilege. So I would recommend that one as well. And also to visit Anita Posh's website, Bitcoin for Fairness, to learn a bit more about the work that she is doing in this space as well. She spends a lot of time in Africa, essentially educating people there on how to escape from these financial systems that have been imposed on them through Bitcoin.